We are still in 1 Samuel 17, talking about David and Goliath. Been a lot of things to talk about with this. We'll have lots more today as well. So last week we mainly looked at kind of how things got set up, how David ended up going to the battle line at all, and why he was initially not really appreciated to be there. His brother and some others were not happy that David was being presumptuous, as far as they thought. But David simply saw Goliath differently than the rest of them did. That was our question number 3, how they saw Goliath as a powerful champion who should be feared, as a threat to their lives and a threat to their safety. And David saw him as an uncircumcised Philistine who defied the armies of the living God. So to David, it was simple. To David, he just needed to defeat this enemy of God as he had defeated the other threats that had faced him in the past. So to the other soldiers, that was presumptuous. Very easy for someone who's not a soldier to say, who's not been there on the front lines with them. But David, as we mentioned last week, took the 5 stones with him and his staff in hand, and he went up against Goliath, and he's able to easily, with 1 stone, dispatch Goliath. So I want to start us with a question that's part of David's confidence, but an interesting question for us to consider. Of why did David take 5 stones and his staff with him? It's kind of a specific number in that it is 5, yet he only ever uses 1. There's a few different ideas floating out there as to what this could be. Gail. Okay, yeah, so let's talk about the brother thing, because this is one of the distinct possibilities, though a hard one to completely prove. Where this comes from is 2 Samuel 21. If you want to turn over there for a moment. So 2 Samuel 21, verses 15 through 22. This is quite a bit later on, when David is already king, and he is at war with the Philistines. So we'll get to this much later when we're in 2 Samuel, but this will be something we can look at now as well. He says, "There was war again between the Philistines and Israel, and David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines, and David grew weary. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid, and attacked the Philistine and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, 'You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel.' After this, there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Sibbecai, the Hushathite, struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Elhanan, the son of Jer-oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, or your translation may say, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. We'll get there in a moment. The shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants." So here we have people who have descended from the giants, it says, and one of them, an unnamed one, specifically being identified as a very large man with 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand and foot. People who seem to be as impressive as Goliath was, who seem like they are related to Goliath, potentially, that they could be his brothers. There are a couple of interesting little quirks with this, though. So one of the things in the translation that I'm reading from, the ESV and some others, it lists the third one as being Goliath himself, whereas some other translations say the brother of Goliath. So where this comes from is in 2 Samuel, it does literally just say Goliath. But in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, it specifically says the brother of Goliath. So the thinking there is maybe this is a corruption in that somehow the brother of got lopped off somewhere along the way, and that this is not meant to be Goliath himself, but meant to be his brother. That also helps fix a contradiction that here Goliath, or the brother of Goliath, is killed by Elhanan, and we already know that David killed Goliath, so that seems pretty compelling to me between 1 Chronicles' take on it and the contradiction of who actually killed Goliath, that this is probably the brother of Goliath rather than Goliath himself. So, if this is the same Goliath, which seems plausible, then we are left with Goliath that David kills in 1 Samuel 17, and 4 brothers who are also imposing and powerful champions. Well, 4 and 1 does make 5. Is that a coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. So there's some speculation that what could have happened is that David knew about Goliath's 4 brothers. And so there's a symbolic nature to the fact that as he picks up 5 stones, that he's saying, I am prepared and ready to kill not just the giant in front of me, but also his 4 brothers, if they come after me as well. So that would be far beyond what anyone in the Israelite army was ever thinking of doing, because they don't even want to fight Goliath. So that sort of thing would be strengthened even more if those 4 brothers are there and part of that army, which they may have been. They could have been standing alongside of Goliath or right behind him as a way of intimidating further, or they could have just been known and been legendary as mighty champions of the Philistines. The problem might be a strong word, the challenge with this is there were a lot of maybes and ifs in that explanation because we don't know all of this for sure. We're not 100% sure that this is the same Goliath, though it seems likely. And we have no complete proof that David even knew that there were 4 brothers, or that that was the reasoning for the 5 stones. So I find it extremely interesting and compelling in a lot of ways that David can be doing the 5 stones for the 5 brothers. Ultimately, it's impossible to prove, but it is one very compelling possibility here. The other possibilities, just to be complete with this, is we can just simply say that 5 is not an important number, that it serves no purpose beyond if it had said David picked up some stones. That has its own challenges as well, because it is specifying that there's 5. But again, if you think about this, it is a very small number of stones for a very mighty giant. Importantly, David was never told by God that he would be able to kill Goliath with 1 stone. So it's not as if he is saying, I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to do what God has told me, therefore I should take some extras with me. He is taking what he would normally take as a shepherd, a small handful of quality, smooth stones. If you're going to sling a stone, it needs to be smooth and regular. If you want it to be able to exit the sling in some predictable manner. If it's jagged or if it is off balance, then you're not going to be able to aim effectively with it. So David carefully finds the 5 stones that suit his purpose, and he has tools at his disposal in order to kill Goliath. And one of the strengths of this is the 5 stones would not be any more of a lack of faith than the staff would be, because he takes his staff into battle as well, and that's something that he never uses. So we don't need to worry too much about why David is taking extra things into battle. Definitely not a lack of faith. There's no sense in which he is being overkill or extra cautious. 5 stones and a staff are what a shepherd takes to protect against animals, not what a warrior takes to fight against a giant. So in no sense is this a large problem here. David also may have been prepared for the possibility that he would be fighting more than just Goliath. Maybe let's not worry about the brothers for a moment. What if the Philistines don't honor the terms of a duel? What if after Goliath is killed that they decide to come into battle anyway and they come and attack David? So he is prepared with a little bit more than what he might need in order to do this. Ultimately, we don't have a perfect answer from anything that I can come up with as I've studied through this, but we do have a few compelling possibilities. Did you have any additional thoughts on that? Anything that I missed in that analysis of it? Yeah.
You know, like you said, the Bible does not specifically say why.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, any of those possibilities could be plausible.
Yeah, definitely. And what we should be getting out of this more than anything is the massive pillar of faith that David is being at this point. That he is willing to go into battle with what is clearly not enough to defeat Goliath under any normal circumstances.
Yeah, the normal soldiers there had their armor, their sword, stuff like that. David didn't go with that.
Right.
He had to use Goliath's sword.
Yeah. Yeah, this is not, don't read too much into it of knowing that David was able to do it with 1 stone and think, oh, he's got 5 times more than he needs. 5 stones is, under any normal circumstances, probably not enough to defeat a giant. You've got to actually hit, and you have to be successful enough to hit the right spot and probably some element of luck for that to have the intended effect on such a mighty warrior like Goliath. So if I'm going into battle against a giant, against this mighty champion, I want to take everything I can with me. I want to have as many weapons as I know how to use and as much backup and contingency plans. You know, Goliath has a spear and a sword and all of these weapons of war. David doesn't have that, even though it's been offered to him. He has not taken that into battle. He is instead going as a shepherd before Goliath rather than a warrior before Goliath. That being said, the brother thing is cool, and it, even if it's not completely provable, it's compelling for a lot of reasons. And with the faith of David, I don't have a problem believing that he wouldn't just stop at 1. That if the 4 brothers are going to come at him too, and more importantly, come at God and at God's people, that David would be willing to slay 5 giants instead of just the 1. So that's why 5 stones and a staff, more emblematic of being a shepherd than anything.
Yeah, I lean toward the brother thing myself, and we talked about that and stuff. But, you know, because it doesn't say that he picked up, 6 stones.
Right.
Or the perfect number 7 stones.
Mm-hmm.
It's specifically 5.
Yeah.
So, and that's just my personal belief.
Yeah, and that's the strength of that argument, that it does specifically say 5, which is a weird number to specify if it doesn't have significance. So yeah, all of them you have to make a little bit of an assumption somewhere, and all of them are not necessarily the primary point of the story. But yeah, when we talked about it, I hadn't heard that explanation before, which is why that was so compelling and interesting to me. So I enjoy when y'all bring these sorts of things up to me. That's there's some amazing insights that we get as we dive in more and more. Ultimately, though, what we're seeing most powerfully is David's faith. That David is rejecting what Saul has to offer, and he has such perfect faith in God that he does not stop to consider this looks like from a military perspective. This, to me, is a lot like what Jonathan said when he and his armor bearer went up against the Philistine camp, or the Philistine garrison, and where it was just the two of them fighting against this garrison. Because Jonathan said, well, if the Lord wants to give us victory, he can do it by few or by many. It doesn't really matter how many of us there are. So he had learned some kind of lesson from things like, Gideon, right? Of God reducing the number of soldiers available to show that it wasn't about Israel's military power. Jonathan knew that. I think David knew that too. Because it wasn't going to be a question of how skilled is David with a sword, which at this point is probably not very. He's not a soldier. He's not been in the army. He is a shepherd, so he doesn't have much opportunity to really wield a sword or a spear. This is not what he's doing on a daily basis. And even if you think, okay, I could probably pick one up and swing it around a bit, that's great when you're fighting a training dummy, not great when you're fighting a champion from the other side, where you're going to get impaled by this spear. It's like a weaver's beam. Like, let's not be naive about it, right? This is frightening. But David doesn't stop to consider any of this absurdity. If God wants to give victory, then it doesn't matter what kind of power David has. Aaron.
It wasn't long ago that the only Israelites that had swords were Saul and Jonathan. Do we think that the entire army at this point is equipped with swords?
That's a good question. And I don't know how much things would have changed by now. So they have had some kind of victory over the Philistines since. So I don't know if the Philistines would have been able to continue that same level of oppression and being able to keep the blacksmiths away from them. But that sort of thing doesn't change overnight anyway, right? Even if now we have blacksmiths again, now we're able to make swords, it's not as simple as just, okay, boom, everyone has a sword. So yeah, that's something I hadn't considered either. They probably by this point don't all have swords, though I would think by now it's probably more than just Saul and Jonathan. So that's a good point too. Yeah.
They would have had enough weapons of some type to keep the Philistines at bay, because the Philistines were not, just coming over and taking them.
Right.
So they were at least, had enough weapons to have the standstill.
Right, yeah, they had that victory before. They didn't finish the job because of Saul's kind of wavering, and things had been at this weird, uneasy standstill for a while. So to be clear, they had weapons of some kind, even when the Philistines were keeping the swords from them. But they were weapons more of wood and stone rather than of metal, which is a distinct disadvantage. So, yeah, don't know if exactly how many swords they would have had by this point, but probably fair to say that they are not as fully equipped as they would like to be. So that's a good point, Aaron. All the more reason why David does not have this extensive experience with swords, that he's not going to be able to get a hold of one for some portion of his life. And not like a shepherd really needs one anyway. Okay. What else do I want to... Okay, yeah, so when David kills Goliath, the big point here, right, there was no sword, that David took into battle with him. So when he cuts off Goliath's head, he has to use Goliath's own sword to do it. So it's a powerful manifestation of his victory here. It's a single stone from a sling, and he has incapacitated Goliath so much that he's able to take his own sword from him and to finish the job. Okay, So let's make some more contrasts, because there's, unfortunately, the thing that we do sometimes with David and Goliath, as we have pulled this out of its context, is we make the primary point about it that God will help you overcome the Goliaths in your life. And to be fair, that's not a bad application for the story. And it's a good thing for us to consider. But it isn't even really the main point of the story. There's a big contrast here between Saul and David. And as we are seeing Saul in his decline and David in his rise, the contrast of the methods and character and even the consequences of their actions gives us a lot of information that we need to progress through the book of 1 Samuel. So, let's think about Saul and David. Saul is the popular warrior king. Remember that the people were happy to see him anointed as king because he's head and shoulders above the rest. So, like Goliath was the champion of the Philistines and the physically imposing one there, while Saul was not a giant, so to speak, whereas Goliath probably does qualify as that, that Saul is the physically imposing person of the Israelites. He's the one you look at and go, yeah, that's my king. He is a man that I don't want to have to fight in a duel. He's a man who can lead us into battle. He will bring us victory. And the entire reason why Israel wanted a king was to be able to deal with these incursions from the Philistines primarily and from the other nations around them. So Saul ticks all the boxes. He's a popular king. Even though a few people did resist Saul at first, they came around pretty quickly when Saul showed what he could do. This is the warrior king. Yet what is Saul doing here? For a warrior king, is he doing much fighting or leading? What image do you get of Saul's power in this whole standoff with Goliath? Gary.
Verse 11 of this chapter says Saul was afraid, just like all the other people. He was afraid.
Right. Saul is afraid like everyone else. The whole point of Saul being king was to not be afraid like everyone else. The whole point of his reign was to rally the people like he did in chapter 11 or whatever it was, where he said, we're going to war, and if you don't come with me, I'll chop your animals in half because we have God's work to do. We're going to save our own brethren from destruction. So that's the kind of leadership that he had previously. Now, we don't see Saul whipping the people up into a frenzy and saying, we're going to battle, I'll go against Goliath myself, or encouraging some champion to go do that. He doesn't do any of that. He is there paralyzed with fear like the rest of them. Gary and then Jeff?
Paralyzed and then didn't ask God to help me with my fear. Or
Yeah.
should I go against Goliath? Go to God and
Yeah. Yeah, even if Saul's going to be unsure, even if he's second guessing himself, which, okay, he's human. That could even be understandable. The correct thing to do would be to inquire of God. Are you giving us the victory here? What should we do? Should we go into battle? Will we be successful? Saul doesn't do any of that. He's stuck in his own insecurity about his lack of power, lack of capability to overcome the Philistines.
Power sometimes corrupts people. I mean, he's been a king, like you said, he started out, with all his power, and he's on fire and stuff, but now it's like, trusting in himself instead of in God. I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, but it's always I,
Yeah.
not, God.
Yeah.
So, and now he comes to the thing where he's with Goliath, and so I don't think I can do this.
Yeah. Right. That's as Saul's problems increase and the opposition against him increases, his faith falters and he's not able to see that God is going to give the victory. It's all about his own power, his own capability, and right now he doesn't feel like he's able to do it. And so he's failing God, he's failing his people, he's failing himself, and this standoff is just going to continue until morale drops even more and the people just flee. Lauren?
I can't remember the exact timeline as far as when David wrote some of the Psalms and how old he was, but I'm pretty sure in Psalm 20, isn't it David that says, some may trust in horses and some may trust in chariots, but we will trust in the Lord our God. I feel like that contrast fits really well with this story. He's showing that for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that is a lesson that David learned time and time again, because with very few exceptions, and the time that David numbered the people as kind of glorifying his own power is really the lone exception that I can think of for this. Aside from that, David has a pretty good, solid understanding of the fact that his victories don't come from the military prowess that he has. Whether that's him personally or the nation that he will later lead and how many soldiers they have, he's learned the appropriate lessons from history, from his own life. That, hey, let's be honest, the lion is stronger than the young shepherd. Okay, a lion should be able to tear a young shepherd into pieces. A bear should be able to tear a young shepherd into pieces. A giant who is a champion of war should be able to thrust that weaver's beam of a spear right through David and kill him instantly. None of those things happened because David trusted in God.
When he even turned down Saul's armor and weaponry that
Yeah.
he was able to use in that battle facing Goliath, but kind of going back to that astounding act of faith that you were describing with his weapon choices.
Yeah. Let's talk about that some more. So David turns down Saul's armor, Saul's weapons. That's, if we can understand that there were some limitations to the number of weapons that they had by this point, which is probably true, then Saul is providing David with the best they have to offer. Certainly, he is going to have one of the finest swords and the finest armor that is available to the nation. And so he says, look, you're going into battle against Goliath. I will equip you with everything that I have. Now, that sounds pretty good, but there's a few reasons why David isn't going to accept this. And why might that be? Why doesn't David want to use the armor and the swords?
First, physically, most likely, because Saul is a grown man, and David at this point is not. So, first of all, it probably wouldn't fit him exactly right for him to use it or be overefficient.
Yeah. And David probably is a grown man by this point, but yeah, this is armor made for somebody who is head and shoulders above the rest of the people. So there is some realistic chance that this is not perfectly fitting David. Yeah. Jeff?
Well, and David said, he has not heard those things. So, he's, at this point, he's not been skilled in the swords and stuff like that, but he has been skilled with the sling
Yeah.
and stuff. So he took what he was familiar with into battle and
Yeah.
not something that he had not been proven in the battle.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Maria?
I agree with Emily. He already knew that he could kill the bear and the lion and stuff the way he did, so he knew he can do that, treating it the same way. But I also think too, in chapter 18, verse 5 and verse 15, it talks that David was wise. It sounds like he thought about things before he did things, and the Lord was with him. So I think in thinking the process through and not just taking what somebody says, but thinking realistically instead of with emotions, showed his, and again, trusting in God,
Yeah.
showed his, what do I want to say, showed the outcome of the right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, He has the proper outcome from this because he is thinking through what the best option really is. He's not been pressured by the king who's saying, "Look, I'm gonna give you all of these things," and you know, we underestimate how awkward a situation like that would be. You know, a lot of times we simply say yes to things because, well, it's awkward to say no. How much more when it's a king telling you, "Look, here, put all this stuff on and take this with you." David has thought about this. He is being insightful and thoughtful, that he's going to take what he is familiar with and ready for. Mark?
Yeah, there's so much going on here. But when Goliath approaches him, he disdains David because of his youth. And that word means boy. So he looked at it like he was a boy.
Right.
Whether he was a man or not, adolescent or
Yeah.
older teenager, 18, he could have been
Yeah.
close to being of fighting age. I don't think he was. But he was considered a boy when Goliath looked at him. And that made him even more. But beyond that, for me, I see two different approaches here. One guy who just relies on God, and Saul who does not. Saul's already been rejected by God. The Spirit of God has left Saul as well. And you can say whatever you want about that. If Saul was seeking after God with all of his might, God would not have resisted and would have been with Saul.
Yeah.
But Saul did not.
Right.
And that ultimately is what I see as far as what's happening between two people and the comparison between the two people. And later we see that Saul doesn't know who David is yet.
Yeah.
In this instance. So there's so many things going on. We know that eventually Saul calling for him, and the calling is kind of interesting in itself because it seems like he doesn't know who David is. So there's kind of an interesting reading in that. And it's just maybe the historical writing. So there's a lot going on here to reconcile.
Yeah.
Historically, but spiritually, David is the outstanding young person here who's just relying on God. And I questioned in my first readings of this years and years ago whether David was embellishing or whether he really did kill a lion and a bear. David, in my mind, killed a lion and a bear.
Yeah.
He grabbed one by the chin and dispatched it.
Yeah.
So God is with David here in this, like he was with the strong guy, I can't remember his name, sorry.
Samson.
I wanna say
Yeah.
Solomon.
Samson.
Samson,
Yeah.
thank you. I keep saying Solomon. I think it's Samson. But
Yeah.
God is absolutely with David, and he just knows it. He's like, yeah, I killed a bear.
Yeah.
So that's just what I see.
Yeah, no, you dead on. And to clarify on the age of David here, Saul calls him a youth. Goliath also kind of calls him a boy, although Goliath is specifically trying to be derogatory. So, that maybe don't take that as like a specific identification of just how old he is. But he's coming at him like a young person too, not like a mighty warrior. He's coming out in simple shepherd garb and equipment. But the reason why I push back a little bit to the David being a kid thing is somehow in the Bible class version of this that gets told, you have David looking like a little 8-year-old or 10-year-old kid who's there to kill Goliath. He wasn't that young. There's no way he was that young. He was old enough to be managing the flocks on his own, or at least away from his father and away from his brother. And I don't know who else was there, but he's got responsibilities where he's able to travel back and forth between his father's house and the battle line and to take these things with him. So he's not like a young child. That being said, he is the youngest of the brothers, and he is definitely on the younger side, being called a youth, being called a boy, and maybe not yet being of the age where he would be considered eligible to fight in battle. If he is potentially not yet 20. We don't know if that's the case or not. So he could have been like an older teenager, or a teenager of some variety. That all is quite possible. That should only elevate the fact that it's David's faith and not his prowess that is the deciding factor for the victory here. But yeah, don't have in your mind this idea of a little kid who is fighting against Goliath. Yeah, and I also agree. I don't think David is embellishing here on killing the lion and the bear. That would not, if you know you're embellishing, it's not going to do much for your confidence, right? I can say, oh, I can do anything. I've killed lions and I've never killed a lion and a bear. That gives me zero confidence to make a statement like that. That only makes sense if David truly has done these things. He's got the experience of trusting in God and realizing that God is keeping him safe. And then this is not a blind trust in God either, because hey, plenty of people die in battle and plenty of people die to wild animals, and why should David assume that he's not going to be one of them? Well, because God, I'll let you answer. Why should David assume that he's going to do this? Other people have died in battle. Aaron. Hey, yeah, he's been anointed. This anointing is a mark of God's favor and some promise to him that he's going to be with him, that he's going to be made king later on, but also just that God is with him. So there is reason for David to believe that he's going to be successful. Yeah, Lauren.
I just think it's really powerful when we get down to where, in verse 26, where David shows up to deliver his provisions for his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
That when he gets there and he sees the standoff and what's happening and sees the fear of the Israelites and hears how the Philistines are mocking God
Yeah.
and them. And his first reaction is, who are these people to defy the living God?
Yeah.
His attitude and when he just gets there, when he's not a part of it at all, that's what bothers him as soon as he's there. He's not afraid by the physique. He's not afraid of any of the physical stuff. The first thing that hits his mind is they're defying God.
Yeah.
How can he say these things?
Yeah.
That just speaks volumes of his character.
And that's what we mean by saying that David just sees the situation differently than anyone else does. Everyone else is concerned with the physical battle, and David sees there's a spiritual confrontation here too. Okay, so the other bigger symbolic thing behind this, it's about more than just David not being able to fit in Saul's armor or not knowing how to use the sword. That is part of it. The other part of it is Saul's efforts will provide 0% of the victory. And that's really important for this narrative. So Saul is contributing nothing to the cause. Goliath is only going to fall because of David and David's faith in God.
Saul did contribute something, and that is Saul, because David said, well, what's going to be happening if to the person who kills this person, kills Goliath? And the men told him, well, he's going to get these free, his father's house will be free in Israel. He's going to get Saul's daughter and stuff like that. So Saul did put up these things, hoping to get a champion to go out and fight him, because Saul wasn't willing to do it.
Right, yeah.
It's like, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you all this if you go out and fight him instead of, But that's not the reason why David did it. He didn't do it for those riches or for Saul's daughter or whatever. He did it because it was an uncircumcised Philistine blaspheming God.
Yeah. So Saul does offer those things, and David will receive those things. And so in that sense, Saul is contributing something. But as far as it's not a matter of Saul's soldiers who do it, or Saul's equipment, or Saul's grand plan, or anything like that. It's David. only after Goliath is killed, when David has turned the tide, when God has turned the tide, then that's when the soldiers are able to rush forward and able to chase the Philistines away. And so Saul is able to contribute at that point. He's contributed with what he has promised to give to the champion who kills Goliath. And he contributes after, but he is in this weird, impotent standoff here where he's not able to get over the hurdle of actually killing Goliath. Aaron?
What were the terms of the champions fighting, and did they honor those terms?
Yeah, so that's kind of a question that I had as well, in that it is a duel, and so then you expect that maybe both sides are just going to walk away and finish this. Really, now what's going to happen is when the duel is over, the winners of the duel have been able to save themselves more of the losses. Israel has the God-given task of routing the Philistines and of killing them. So I don't necessarily see a problem with how they continued to fight against the Philistines after. But it is an interesting question there on why exactly it turned out like that. Excuse me. Okay, so David, here's what I want you to see out of David. As David's problems increase, his faith rises to match the occasion. He is able to still overcome. A lion and a bear are a big deal, but it's Goliath who is the bigger threat to him. This is a pattern that will continue throughout David's life. So Goliath is not the largest problem that David will ever face. He's going to have to deal with the troubles of being king. He's going to have to deal with armies that are coming against him. Now he is in control. He's going to have to deal with these pagan people that he's trying to defeat. He has to deal with his own son who wants to depose and kill him, with other enemies who want to kill him. David has a lot of problems to deal with, and his faith rises to meet the challenge every time. Saul didn't do that. Saul was unstable from the beginning, and then his faith falters. I say unstable from the beginning in the sense that he was somewhat wishy-washy. He had some good and bad at the beginning. There were some good things, some really good things at the beginning too, where his faith was sufficient for the occasion. But then as his problems increase, he does not continue to grow in his relationship with God. So the contrast between David and Saul is huge here. And we're seeing why God is so impressed with David and why God has chosen David specifically to take Saul's place. David is not just somebody other than Saul. He is somebody with a very different character than Saul. So David is ready no matter what has to happen. There's other problems too, when Saul wants to kill him, when the nation is split over who they want to support, all of those things. But David is able to conquer all of those. Additionally, the victory is a sign of Yahweh's victory over the Philistine gods. So the military battles that took place were often thought to be battles between the gods. And we know from 1 Kings 20 that some of the people around them thought that Israel's God, Yahweh, was a God of the hills. And so don't fight the Israelites in the hills because they have some extra power there. Their God is really good in the hills, but if you can get them down in the valleys, well, their God's not there in the valleys. Well, where did the battle between David and Goliath take place? In the valley. Yeah. So, turns out Yahweh has just as much power in the valleys as he does in the hills. And to those of us who don't have this pagan understanding of gods, we're not surprised by that, but they were. So I don't know if the Philistines had that same impression of Yahweh the Assyrians did in thinking that Yahweh was only a god of the hills. But if they did, then this was a slap in the face for sure. Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, it's the whole thing about Goliath I see it, I look at that very last verse in the chapter where Abner brings David and he says, "Who are you?"
Yeah.
He says, I'm the son of Jesse. And it's like God used this occasion to let Saul know who the next guy was. And it really sets up the drama that happens next.
Yeah.
Where Saul becomes this paranoid guy. He actually asks David to come and be with him to sing in songs and things.
Yeah.
So he, know who you're, have your enemies close to you is what
Yeah.
he does after this. And he has this big struggle. He basically goes crazy after
Yeah.
this because he walks away from God.
Yeah. And the timeline of it is slightly difficult in knowing, I'm kind of inclined to believe that David came in first as the court musician for Saul. And he was just basically some anonymous musician to Saul. Saul didn't care who it was, helping him with some of the paranoia and the stress that he was dealing with. Then we have the incident with David and Goliath, and then now Saul knows more specifically who David is and makes him his armor bearer. It's given a little out of order, so the other possibility is that it's after David and Goliath that he's even brought in as court musician. But there are some other issues with that too. It's a little hard to get the total sequence of events here. But regardless, by the end of this event, Saul knows who David is very clearly. And he has this weird relationship with David going forward where he loves what he can do for him and is soothed by him, by the playing of the music, and trusts him to be his armor bearer. But then also tries to kill him and does all of these other crazy things. These are the actions of a paranoid man who is under a great deal of stress. Okay, cool. There's more we could talk about with David and Goliath, but 2 weeks is probably enough. So next week we will move on to chapter 18. It'll be lesson 9, and we'll see how the story continues.